Before we open the files on this decades-old mystery that spanned 2 continents and destroyed the quiet life of a Warsaw family, please make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. We uncover the secrets history tried to bury, and your support helps us dig deeper. The story begins not with a bang, but with a silence. It was the suffocating, heavy silence of a Warsaw winter, the kind that swallows sound along with the light. The date was December 12, 1970. The location was the dreary, concrete expanse of the Gdansk railway station in northern Warsaw. At 5:15 p.m., the sun had long since set, and the city was wrapped in a freezing fog that smelled of low-grade coal smoke and damp wool. Elżbieta Ela Kaminska, a 34-year-old translator for the Ministry of Foreign Trade, stepped off the number 15 tram. She was a woman who, by design, did not stand out. She wore a heavy gray wool coat, a thick scarf wrapped high around her neck to ward off the biting wind, and sturdy leather boots that had seen better days. In her hand, she carried a brown leather satchel, the kind used by thousands of bureaucrats across the Polish People's Republic. To any observer, she was just another tired citizen commuting home after a long day of navigating the labyrinth of state bureaucracy. She was supposed to meet her husband, Marek, at the station entrance. It was their Friday routine. They would walk the remaining 4 blocks to their apartment complex together, perhaps stopping at the state-run grocery store, if the rumors of a fresh delivery of carper cheese turned out to be true. Marek, an architect who spent his days designing the very gray blocks they lived in, was waiting by the ticket kiosk, checking his watch. 5:20 p.m. passed, then 5:30. By 5:45, the anxiety began to set in. In 1970s Poland, punctuality wasn't just a courtesy, it was a survival mechanism. If you were late, it meant something had happened. The tram had broken down. The militia had set up a checkpoint. Or, in the hushed whispers of the time, someone had been taken. Marek paced the cold pavement, his breath pluming in the yellow light of the station lamps. He watched the commuters stream past, a river of gray and brown coats, scanning every face for the familiar sharp cheekbones and tired eyes of his wife. He checked the tram stop. He asked a kiosk vendor if she had seen a woman matching Ela's description. The woman just shook her head, pulling her shawl tighter, unwilling to get involved in someone else's trouble. At 6:30 p.m., Marek made the decision to walk home alone, hoping against hope that she had simply caught an earlier connection or had gone straight to the apartment to care for their 5-year-old daughter, Agata, who was being watched by a neighbor. But when he unlocked the door to apartment 4B on Mickiewicza Street, the air inside was stale and cold. The neighbor, Mrs. Kowalska, looked up from the knitting in her lap, expecting to be relieved of her duties. "Where is Ela?" she asked. The question hung in the narrow hallway, bouncing off the thin walls. Marek didn't have an answer. He checked the kitchen. The morning's tea mugs were still in the sink. He checked the bedroom. The bed was made. Nothing was out of place. It was as if she had simply ceased to exist between the ministry doors and the tram stop. That night, Marek made the first of many calls to the hospitals. In 1970, the phone lines were crackly and unreliable, monitored by the state and scarce in private homes. He had to run down to the street corner to use a public phone box, feeding it coins with freezing fingers. No admissions matching her name. No Jane Does brought in from traffic accidents. By midnight, the panic had evolved into a cold, hard dread. Marek knew, as every citizen of the Eastern Bloc knew, that people didn't just disappear. If they were gone, there was a reason. And usually, that reason wore a trench coat and carried a badge from the Ministry of Public Security. But Ela wasn't political. She wasn't a dissident. She was a translator who worked with trade manifests and grain quotas. She was a mother who worried about her daughter's cough and the price of butter. Marek returned to the apartment, looking at his sleeping daughter. Agata was curled up with a worn teddy bear, oblivious to the fact that her world had just shattered. He sat by the window, watching the empty snow-dusted street below, waiting for a figure that would never appear. The silence of the apartment was louder than the trams outside. It was the silence of a missing piece, a void that had opened up in the center of their lives. He didn't know it then, staring out into the Warsaw night. But Elżbieta Kaminska hadn't just missed her tram. She had stepped out of one reality and into another. The woman he was waiting for no longer existed in the Polish People's Republic, and the search for her would not end that night or that year. It would take decades, the fall of an empire, and the opening of the most secret archives in the world to understand why a mother would walk away from her life and never look back. To understand why Elżbieta Kaminska's disappearance was treated with such suspicion, we have to immerse ourselves in the atmosphere of Warsaw in late 1970. This was not a city of vibrant colors or easy choices. It was a city recovering from the scars of war, only to be encased in the concrete cast of Soviet influence. The era was defined by the twilight of Władysław Gomułka's leadership, a time of stagnation, frustration, and brewing unrest. The Kaminski family lived in what was euphemistically called moderate comfort. In the hierarchy of the Polish People's Republic, they were the intelligentsia. Marek was an architect helping to rebuild the capital, and Elżbieta was a specialist in the English language, a rare and suspicious skill. Their apartment, a 40-square-meter box in the Zolibors district, was coveted. They had a television, a small collection of Western vinyl records bought on the black market, and shelves lined with books approved by the censors. But comfort in 1970 was relative. Life was a constant logistical struggle. Elżbieta's day didn't start with coffee and contemplation. It started with strategy. Before work, she would stand in line at the bakery, hoping for bread that wasn't stale. After work, she would scour the shops for meat, toilet paper, or shoes for Agata. The economy was failing. The state-controlled media trumpeted record production numbers, steel quotas exceeded, and grain harvests overflowing. Yet the shelves were empty. This cognitive dissonance, the gap between the propaganda of success and the reality of scarcity, was the psychological backdrop of their lives. Elżbieta worked at the Ministry of Foreign Trade, a brutalist building in the city center that hummed with the quiet tension of the Cold War. Her job was technically mundane, translating technical manuals, trade agreements, and agricultural reports from Polish to English and vice versa. However, in a closed society, information is currency. The ministry was one of the few places in Poland where the curtain twitched, where the reality of the West wasn't just a rumor but a tangible flow of data. Colleagues described Elżbieta as professional, reserved, and incredibly sharp. She wasn't the type to gossip in the break room or complain about the party secretary. She kept her head down. This was a survival trait. In the ministry, everyone was watched. The person at the desk next to you might be an informant. The janitor might be reporting to the Służba Bezpieczeństwa, the SB, the secret police. Trust was a luxury few could afford. Marek, in later interviews conducted years after the Iron Curtain fell, described his wife as carrying a private sadness in the months leading up to December 1970. He attributed it to the general malaise of the country. The air in Warsaw was thick with tension that winter. The government was preparing to announce massive price hikes on food, a move they knew would trigger outrage. The average citizen could feel the storm coming. She was distracted, Marek would recall. She would sit with a book in her lap for an hour and never turn the page. When I asked her what was wrong, she would just smile that tight little smile and say she was tired. We were all tired. I didn't think it was anything more than that. But looking back, the signs were there. Elżbieta had begun volunteering for overtime at the ministry, claiming there was a backlog of agricultural reports. She took fewer walks with Agata. She became obsessive about the mail, always checking the box before Marek could get to it. And there were the headaches, migraines that would send her to lay in the dark bedroom for hours, staring at the ceiling with a look of intense concentration, as if she were trying to solve a complex equation in her head. The social circle of the Kaminskis was small. They associated mostly with other professionals, doctors, engineers, professors. Evenings were spent drinking tea or vodka, smoking harsh cigarettes, and talking about everything except politics. But politics was like the weather. Even if you didn't talk about it, you were freezing in it. What Marek didn't know, what no one in their circle knew, was that Elżbieta's world had expanded beyond the gray walls of Warsaw. Through her work, she had caught a glimpse of the machinery behind the state's failure. She saw the numbers that proved the government was exporting food to the Soviet Union, while Polish citizens stood in lines for scraps. She saw the technological backwardness, the mismanagement, the lies printed on official letterhead. For most people, this knowledge resulted in cynicism. For Elżbieta, it seemingly produced something else, a dangerous resolve. The Warsaw of 1970 was a cage, and while most people were busy decorating their bars, Elżbieta Kaminska was apparently looking for the key. On the morning of December 12th, she had kissed Agata on the forehead, straightened Marek's tie, and walked out the door with her brown satchel. She left behind the gray reality, the queues, the empty shelves, and the husband who loved her. She walked into the fog, and the city swallowed her whole. When Marek Kaminski walked into the local Citizens Militia MO precinct on the morning of December 13th, he was a man on the verge of collapse. He had not slept. He was still wearing the same clothes from the day before. The precinct smelled of stale tobacco and floor wax. A sergeant with a bored expression and a stain on his uniform tunic sat behind a high wooden desk, slowly typing a report with 2 fingers. "My wife is missing," Marek said, his voice cracking. The sergeant didn't look up immediately. Missing persons in 1970 were viewed through a prism of skepticism. Usually it was a husband who drank too much and woke up in a sobering-up station, or a teenager running off with a lover. A respectable mother and ministry employee vanishing into thin air was an inconvenience to the paperwork. "Name?" the sergeant asked, finally sliding a form across the desk. "Elżbieta Kaminska. She works at the Ministry of Foreign Trade. She didn't come home yesterday." At the mention of the ministry, the sergeant's demeanor shifted slightly. State employees were different. Their disappearances had implications. He picked up the phone and dialed a number, speaking in low, muffled tones. Within an hour, the complexion of the room changed. 2 men in plain clothes entered. They didn't introduce themselves, but they didn't have to. They were SB, Security Service. They wore well-tailored suits that contrasted with the militia's shabby uniforms. One was older, with a face like crumpled paper. The other was young, sharp, and eager. "Citizen Kaminski," the older one said, "let's discuss your wife's absence." The interrogation that followed was not an investigation into a missing person. It was an investigation into a potential crime against the state. They didn't ask what she was wearing or if she had any medical conditions. They asked about her work. Who did she talk to? Did she bring documents home? Did she have friends from the West? Has she expressed anti-socialist sentiments? Marek was bewildered. "She's a translator," he pleaded. "She's a mother. Something has happened to her. You need to check the hospitals, the morgues." "We check everything, citizen," the younger agent snapped. "But people don't just get lost in Warsaw. They run or they hide." The implication was clear. They suspected defection. Or worse, they suspected Marek knew something. They held him for 12 hours. They searched his pockets, his wallet, his mind. They made him recount every conversation from the last month. They asked about their finances, about Agata's school, about the books on their shelves. While Marek was being grilled in the precinct, a team was sent to the apartment on Mickiewicz Street. Mrs. Kowalska, the neighbor watching Agata, was terrified as the men turned the apartment upside down. They pulled books from shelves, shaking them to see if notes fell out. They lifted the mattress. They went through Elżbieta's underwear drawer. They confiscated a stack of letters, family photo albums, and Marek's architectural sketches. Agata sat in the corner, clutching her teddy bear, watching silent tears roll down her face. She was 5 years old, and the sanctity of her home was being violated by strangers who smelled of aggression. Back at the station, Marek was finally released, but not before being given a stern warning. "Do not leave the city. Do not discuss this with anyone. If she contacts you, you call this number immediately. If you fail to do so, you will be considered an accomplice to treason." Marek walked home in the snow, a broken man. He found his apartment ransacked, his daughter traumatized, and his wife labeled a traitor before a single shred of evidence had been found. The official investigation was, by design, opaque. The militia put out a basic bulletin, but the SB took control of the real file. They designated the case with a cryptonym, Seagull. To the public, Elżbieta Kaminska was a missing person. To the state, she was a security breach. In the weeks that followed, Marek tried to conduct his own search. He visited the tram depots, asking drivers if they had seen her. He put up handwritten flyers on telephone poles, only to find them torn down the next day. He went to the ministry, demanding to speak to her supervisor, but was barred by security guards who looked at him with a mixture of pity and contempt. "Go home, Kaminsky," one guard whispered to him one afternoon. "She's gone. Stop asking questions before you disappear too." The investigation was a sham in terms of finding a lost woman, but it was incredibly thorough in terms of dismantling her life. The state needed to know if she had taken secrets. They audited her work logs. They interviewed her office mates. They analyzed her translations for hidden codes. The conclusion the SB reached, documented in files that would gather dust for 30 years, was inconclusive. There was no evidence of contact with foreign intelligence, no evidence of a lover, no train tickets purchased, no border crossings recorded. It was as if she had dissolved. For Marek, the lack of answers was a torture that renewed itself every morning. He had to explain to Agatha why Mommy wasn't coming back. He had to tell a 5-year-old that her mother hadn't abandoned her, while fighting the growing suspicion in his own heart that perhaps, in some way, she had. The disappearance of Elżbieta Kaminska did not happen in a vacuum. In the communal living of 1970s Warsaw, privacy was an illusion. The walls were thin and the neighbors were bored. The raid on the Kaminsky apartment had been noticed. The men in trench coats, the overturned furniture, the crying child. It was theater for the entire building. In the weeks following the disappearance, the atmosphere around Marek and Agatha changed. Before, they were greeted with smiles and polite nods in the stairwell. Now, conversations stopped when Marek walked by. Eyes were averted. The social ostracization was swift and brutal. In a totalitarian system, bad luck is contagious. If the SB was interested in the Kaminskys, then being friends with the Kaminskys was a liability. The rumors began to circulate, filling the void left by facts. "I heard she ran off with a German businessman," Mrs. Dabrowska from the second floor whispered to anyone who would listen in the milk line. "No, no," countered Mr. Wozniak, a retired railway worker. "It was political. She said something about Gomulka at a party. They took her to the Ministry of Public Security on Rakowiecka Street. She's probably in a basement somewhere." "I heard Marek killed her," another voice added, the darkest rumor of all. "Look at him. He's too quiet. He probably buried her in the foundation of one of those new blocks he's designing." Marek felt the weight of these whispers. He saw the judgment in the eyes of the shopkeepers and the teachers at Agatha's kindergarten. He was the husband of the missing woman, the potential murderer, the husband of a traitor. It was a scarlet letter pinned to his heavy winter coat. He tried to maintain normalcy for Agatha. He learned to braid her hair, though his clumsy fingers struggled with the ribbons. He learned to cook, producing burnt cutlets and lumpy potato pancakes. He read her bedtime stories, his voice steady, even as his mind raced with scenarios of torture and death. But the state was not done with him. Marek was called in for routine questioning once a month for the first year. They would sit him in a small, windowless room and ask the same questions, looking for inconsistencies. They threatened his job. They hinted that Agatha might be better off in state care if he couldn't provide a stable environment. This threat, the removal of his daughter, was what finally broke his spirit of resistance. He stopped asking questions at the ministry. He stopped putting up flyers. He became the gray, quiet man the state wanted him to be. He focused entirely on work and his daughter, building a fortress of silence around their small family. At work, Marek was demoted. He was moved from the design team for the new cultural palace to inspecting sewer schematics for industrial zones. It was a humiliation, a signal that his career was over, collateral damage of his wife's vanishing. He accepted it without complaint. He couldn't afford to be fired. Agatha, meanwhile, grew up in the shadow of the great absence. She learned quickly not to ask about her mother outside the apartment. She saw how people looked at her father. She absorbed the lesson that in Poland the truth was dangerous. Inside the apartment, however, her mother was preserved in amber. Her clothes still hung in the closet. Her perfume bottles gathered dust on the vanity. Marek couldn't bring himself to move them. The year 1970 turned into 1971, then 1975. The riots of December 70, which had surely terrified Elżbieta if she was still in the country, toppled Gomulka and brought Edward Gierek to power. A brief period of prosperity followed. Coca-Cola appeared in shops. People bought Fiat 126p cars. But the Kaminskys remained stuck in that frozen December. Marek never remarried. He devoted his life to Agata, ensuring she studied hard, learned languages, ironically including English, and stayed out of trouble. He was a good father, but a distant one, a man whose heart had been cauterized. The file on Elżbieta Seagull grew thinner as the years went on. The SB agents moved on to newer, more active threats. The Solidarity movement, the strikes in the shipyards, the rise of Lech Walesa. Elżbieta Kaminska became a cold case, a bureaucratic anomaly filed away in the vast archives of the secret police. But while the state forgot, the neighbors kept whispering. For 20 years, Marek Kaminski walked the streets of Zolibors as a suspect in a crime that had never been proven, mourning a woman whose fate was a blank page. He grew old waiting for a door to open, for a phone to ring, for the silence to break. It never did. Not while the communists were in power. Fast forward to the year 2004. Warsaw was a different city. The gray concrete was being covered with colorful billboards advertising mobile phones and Western vacations. The Palace of Culture, once a hated symbol of Soviet domination, was now surrounded by glass skyscrapers. Poland was a member of NATO and on the verge of joining the European Union. The fear was gone, replaced by the chaotic energy of capitalism. Agata Kaminska was now 39 years old. She was a historian, working at the University of Warsaw. She had her father's sharp eyes and her mother's intellect. Marek had passed away in 1998, taking his grief and his unanswered questions to the grave. He died of a heart attack, sitting in the same chair by the window where he had waited for Elżbieta 30 years prior. Cleaning out his apartment after the funeral had been a journey through a museum of sorrow. Agata found the box Marek had hidden under the floorboards, the copies of the police reports he had managed to steal or beg for, the handwritten timeline of that day in December 1970, and a single lock of Elżbieta's hair. It was this discovery that ignited a fire in Agata. For her entire life, the disappearance had been a taboo subject, a dark cloud she wasn't allowed to touch. Now, as a professional historian in a free Poland, she had the tools to fight back against the silence. Her primary weapon was the Institute of National Remembrance, IPN. The IPN had been established to investigate crimes committed by the Nazi and communist regimes. They held the archives of the SB, kilometers of files that had been kept secret for decades. Anyone could now request their family's file, provided they could prove a relationship. Agata filled out the forms in triplicate, a grim reminder of the bureaucracy that had swallowed her mother. She waited 6 months for the request to be processed. The anticipation was agonizing. She didn't know what she hoped to find. A death certificate, a confession from a murderer, proof that her mother had been a victim of a random crime. On a rainy Tuesday in November 2004, Agata walked into the IPN reading room. It was a sterile environment, quiet except for the turning of pages and the hum of fluorescent lights. A clerk handed her a thick folder bound in fraying string. The cover was stamped Tyne, top secret, in red ink, now faded to a dull pink. Below that, the cryptonym, Miła, seagull. Agata's hands trembled as she untied the string. The smell of old paper and dust hit her, the smell of the past. She opened the folder and began to read. The file was a chaotic mix of surveillance logs, interrogation transcripts, and internal memos. She saw her father's name, her own name, descriptions of her childhood toys noted by agents who had raided their home. It was a violation, intimate and clinical all at once. She read the initial reports from December 1970. She read the theories: murder, accident, kidnapping. But as she turned the pages, reading through the years, 1971, 1972, 1973, she noticed a pattern. The SB had never stopped looking. There were notes about agents checking unidentified bodies in remote villages. There were requests to foreign stations to check refugee lists in West Germany and France. This was the first shock. The SB hadn't killed her. If the state had executed Elżbieta Kaminska, the file would have been closed, or there would be a coded record of neutralization. Instead, the frustration of the agents dripped from the pages. They were baffled. They called her a phantom. Agata spent days in the reading room, photographing documents, taking notes, applying her historian's eye to the personal tragedy. She built a timeline. She cross-referenced names. And then, on page 204 of the file, she found it. A single typed onion skin carbon copy dated January 14th, 1971. It was a report from an informant codenamed Lecter, who worked within the U.S. Embassy in Warsaw as a janitor. The report was brief. Subject observed burning documents in the incinerator room, unusual amount of shredded paper from the frantic activity in the commercial section on deck 12. Heard vice consul arguing about the package and secure transport. No correlation confirmed, but timing aligns with Seagull event. The package. Agatha stared at the words. In intelligence speak, a package wasn't a box. It was a person. The report had been dismissed by the handler at the time with a scrawled note in the margin. Americans are panicking about the food riots. Lecter is grasping at straws. Ignore. But Agatha couldn't ignore it. The date matched. The timing matched. And her mother worked for the Ministry of Foreign Trade, the exact counterpart to the embassy's commercial section. The realization hit Agatha with the force of a physical blow. Her mother hadn't been murdered. She hadn't been kidnapped by the SB. She hadn't run off with a lover. Elżbieta Kaminska had been extracted. The discovery of the Lecter note changed the trajectory of Agatha's investigation. She was no longer looking for a body. She was looking for a ghost. The idea that her mother, the quiet translator who knit sweaters and made pierogi, was an American intelligence asset seemed ludicrous. It contradicted every memory Agatha had. But the historian in her knew that people are rarely who they seem, especially in times of war, cold or hot. Agatha needed to understand the context. She dove into the history of CIA operations in Poland in the late 60s and early 70s. It was a time of high stakes. The U.S. was desperate for information on the Soviet economy. They knew the USSR and its satellites were lying about their capabilities, but they needed hard data. Grain yields, steel production, trade deficits. These were the boring statistics that determined the balance of power. And who had access to that data? The translators at the Ministry of Foreign Trade. Agatha returned to the IPN archives, searching for a different kind of file. She looked for surveillance on the U.S. Embassy staff from 1970. She found lists of diplomats, attachés, and spies operating under diplomatic cover. One name stood out because of its proximity to her mother's professional circles. Thomas R. Miller, listed as a commercial attaché. According to the SB surveillance logs, Miller was a frequent attendee at the trade fairs in Poznan and Warsaw, events where Elżbieta was often sent to translate. The logs showed them in the same room at least 4 times between 1968 and 1970. There were no notes of them speaking privately, but trade fairs were chaotic, crowded places. A brush pass, a quick exchange of words, a signal. It would have been easy. Agatha dug deeper into Miller. He left Warsaw in January 1971, abruptly reassigned to Washington just weeks after Elżbieta disappeared. The official reason was health issues. The timing was too perfect. Armed with this hypothesis, Agatha did something bold. She reached out to the American side. She contacted a journalist friend in Washington, D.C., a man she had met at a conference years prior. She asked him to file a Freedom of Information Act, FOIA, request regarding Thomas R. Miller and any operations in Warsaw in 1970 involving a Polish national extraction. She knew the CIA wouldn't just hand over a file. It would be redacted, blacked out, denied. But she hoped for a crumb. While she waited, she went back to her mother's personal effects, looking at them through a new lens. She examined the books. Elżbieta loved English literature. Dickens, Austen, Hemingway. Agatha pulled down a copy of The Old Man and the Sea. It was a cheap Polish edition, pages yellowed. She flipped through it, feeling the paper. Nothing. She checked Great Expectations. Nothing. Then she picked up an English-Polish dictionary, a heavy tome that had sat on her father's desk for decades. She fanned the pages. Something fell out. It wasn't a note. It was a receipt. A tiny, faded slip of paper from a cafe in the Old Town, Kawiarnia Literacka. The date was November 14, 1970. On the back of the receipt, in her mother's handwriting, were a series of numbers. 12/12/1715. Agatha stared at it. It looked like a date and a time. December 12th, 1715, 5:15 p.m. That was the time Elżbieta had stepped off the tram, or rather, the time she was supposed to meet Marek. But what if the numbers weren't for meeting Marek? What if they were the go signal? Agata realized with a sinking heart that her mother's disappearance hadn't been an impulse. It had been scheduled, calculated. Elżbieta had written it down a month in advance. She had looked at her husband and daughter every day for 4 weeks, knowing the exact minute she would leave them forever. This wasn't a kidnapping. It was an abandonment. The pain of this realization was sharper than the mystery. Agata felt a surge of anger toward the woman she had mourned for 30 years. How could she? How could any mother choose politics over her child? But Agata forced herself to breathe. She was a historian. She needed the full picture. She needed to know why. What information was so valuable that it was worth the life of a family? 2 months later, the journalist in Washington called. "Agata," he said, his voice buzzing with excitement. "The FOIA request came back. It's mostly black ink, but they missed a redaction in the footer of one page. It refers to an operation called Winter Harvest, and there's a reference to a verified asset with the cryptonym librarian. Librarian, a translator, a keeper of books and words. And Agata," the journalist continued, "I found an obituary. Thomas R. Miller died in 2001, but his wife is still alive. She lives in a nursing home in Virginia, and she might be the only person left who knows the truth." Agata booked a ticket to Washington, D.C. the next day. She was going to find the people who stole her mother.